At 19, Morgan Bauer had the kind of energy that made other people feel like they were standing still. She wasn't the quiet type. She didn't fade into the background. She laughed loudly, spoke fast, and moved through the world like tomorrow wasn't promised. On her wrist, she carried a tattoo that felt less like decoration and more like a prophecy. Whatever you love can be taken away. So live like it's your dying day. People who knew her said it fit her perfectly. Bold, fearless, the kind of line you get when you've already decided you won't live cautiously. Her friends described her as all in, the kind of girl who didn't do things halfway. If she was going to change her life, she would do it completely. If she was going to leave, she wasn't going to look back. Morgan came from Aberdeen, South Dakota, place where everyone knows everyone, where your history follows you into every room. She wanted out of that. Not because she hated home, but because she wanted more space to become someone new. City life was what she craved. It didn't matter which city, just the feeling of being anonymous in a crowd, of being able to reinvent yourself without your past watching. She talked about the future like it was a door she could kick open with enough determination. And when she made up her mind, she moved quickly, sometimes too quickly for the people who loved her. Her mom, Sherry, didn't want her to go. Mothers can sense danger in ways they can't always explain. Sherry was the kind of parent who knew Morgan's independence was real, but also knew that independence doesn't protect you from strangers. Before Morgan left, Sherry pressed a penny into her daughter's hand and told her to keep it in her pocket for luck, for safety, for protection, something small she could carry when Sherry couldn't be there. The gesture was simple, but it was full of fear, because Sherry also knew another detail that made her stomach drop. Morgan wasn't moving in with a friend or family. She was moving in with someone she met online. Morgan had answered a Craigslist ad. A roommate and housekeeping arrangement. The plan was that she would help keep a place clean and organized until she could contribute financially. Morgan didn't have a job lined up yet, but she believed she'd find one quickly. She had worked as a waitress before. She was confident she could land on her feet. Atlanta wasn't just a city on a map, it was the beginning of the life she wanted. On February 12, 2016, Morgan flew more than 1,000 miles from South Dakota to Georgia with only a few bags and about $20 from a friend to get her through. It wasn't much money, it wasn't much security, but Morgan wasn't the type to be stopped by numbers. To her, courage filled the gaps, and in the beginning, that courage looked like freedom. The problem with moving fast is that you, Dan T., always see the cliff until you're already in the air. Morgan's Atlanta plan fell apart almost immediately. After just a day, something happened. An argument, a conflict, a misunderstanding that ended with Morgan's belongings tossed outside like trash. No gradual breakdown, no second chance. One day, she had a place to stay. The next day, her bags were on the street. She was alone in a state where she had no support system, and she was too proud to call it a failure. Instead of going home, Morgan doubled down. She checked into a cheap motel, determined to prove she could make it. She told people she was waiting for a tax return. Once it hit her account, she'd have breathing room. Until then, she would do what she had always done, hustle. She applied for jobs, but ran into practical barriers. Without the right paperwork on hand, some employers couldn't move forward. Days passed, money drained, and the pressure tightened around her choices. That's when Morgan started working at a club in Hall County, north of Atlanta. It wasn't the dream, but it was fast cash. It was also a different world, one where strangers watch you like they own you, where the line between attention and danger can blur, and where the people around you might not be safe even if they're smiling. Morgan was trying to build a new life, but she was doing it in survival mode now. Sleep when you can. Work when you can. Trust whoever seems helpful because you don't have the luxury of being cautious. Still, Morgan kept telling herself this was temporary. Just long enough to stabilize. Long enough to get on her feet. Long enough to prove she could do it. And then came February 25th, the night that would become a timestamp in a case file. A date her family would repeat for years, like a prayer and a curse at the same time. That night, Morgan finished her shift and left with two people she knew from the club, Caitlin, another dancer, and Caitlin's boyfriend, Jonathan. On paper, it sounded normal. Coworkers leave together all the time. People ride together. People help each other out. But sometimes the last normal moment of a person's life looks exactly like every other day until it becomes the dividing line between before and after. After that night, Morgan's world went silent. No texts, no calls, no Snapchats, no casual posts, no replies. Friends who talked to her nearly every day suddenly heard nothing. Her phone either died or was turned off. Her social media froze like someone hit pause and walked away. For an influencer or a teenager, total silence isn't just unusual, it's alarming. Sherry knew it immediately. Morgan wanted independence, not disappearance. She wanted city life, not isolation. Morgan was stubborn, yes, but Morgan was not the kind of person who would go completely dark without telling someone. Something was wrong. At first, law enforcement didn't treat it like an emergency. Morgan was 19. She was technically an adult. She had moved voluntarily. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she didn't want to be found. Maybe she was just doing her thing. But Sherry didn't accept that. Mothers don't accept maybe. Sherry heard the silence and recognized it for what it was, a warning. In missing person cases, time is everything. The first hours are where trails are warm. Cameras still have footage. Witnesses still remember what they saw. Phones still have data. The longer it takes to act, the more the world erases the person. Sherry didn't wait. She came to Atlanta. She stayed in cheap motels. She walked streets with flyers. She begged people for information. She called anyone who might have seen her daughter. She did what families do when the system moves too slowly. She tried to become the system. Social media picked up the story fast. Thousands of people shared Morgan's face. A Facebook group formed and grew into the tens of thousands. Tips poured, insightings, rumors, messages from strangers claiming they knew something. For investigators, it was both help and chaos. Every lead had to be checked, even when most were false. Social media can amplify a missing persons case, but it can also bury it under noise. News stations covered Sherry's fight. Billboards went up. Private investigators were brought in. There was talk of big names, people known for other high-profile cases. Joining the search, Sherry pleaded for the public to stay focused. Not on judgment, not on moralizing, not on blaming Morgan for being young and trying to survive, just on finding her. Meanwhile, investigators began piecing together the last verified facts. Morgan had last been seen leaving the club with Caitlin and Jonathan. The couple told police they drove Morgan a long distance away, dropped her at a gas station, and watched her get into another Koran, unknown man, in a green vehicle. That story became the backbone of the early timeline. It was the last thing anyone could anchor to. But there was a problem. The digital evidence didn't fit. Phone data suggested Morgan's last signal came from Porterdale, far from where she was supposedly dropped. If the couple's story was true, why would her phone ping there? What would bring Morgan to a place nearly 80 miles from where she started the night? People argued online. Investigators dug through records, but the case moved slowly, dragged down by contradictions, and the brutal reality that without a body, without a confession, without definitive forensic evidence, a disappearance can stall for years. And it did stall. Weeks became months. Months became years. Sherry kept showing up, year after year, handing out flyers in Atlanta like a ritual of refusal. Active cold case, police said, still listed, still open, still waiting for new leads. A reward was offered. The public moved on and came back in waves, each time hoping the next tip would be the one. Sherry never stopped. Not because she believed she could force a miracle by refusing to accept reality, but because stopping would feel like abandoning her child. Then, 7 years after Morgan went missing, something changed. Not a confession, not a witness walking in, not a sudden breakthrough from an informant. A timeline discrepancy, a detail that should have been noticed from the beginning but only surfaced years later. Like the case itself had been waiting for someone to look at it the right way. For 7 years, the public believed Morgan disappeared on February 25, 2016. It was repeated in articles, interviews, vigils, case summaries. February 25th was the date everyone grieved around. But then investigators discovered something. A video posted on February 26th, Morgan alive, speaking, moving through a park. The location matched the area where her phone last pinged. And in that video, there was a detail that changed everything. Behind Morgan, a man appeared to be following her. That one post reshaped the case. Because if Morgan was alive on February 26th, then the story Caitlin and Jonathan had maintained for years was suddenly unstable. If Morgan's phone pinged in Porterdale, near a residence linked to Jonathan, then the gas station drop-off story didn't just sound suspicious, it sounded strategically convenient. It sounded like distance was being manufactured. It sounded like a narrative meant to make investigators look in the wrong place. Now police had something they didn't have before. Justification for a new search warrant, a reason to reopen the physical world of the suspects, not just their statements, a reason to return to a property connected to Jonathan years later, even if the house had changed owners, even if time had passed, even if evidence had been buried, literally or figuratively. On July 27, 2023, federal and local teams executed a search warrant at a home in Porterdale. Cameras filmed, forensic technicians moving in and out. The current residents, who reportedly had no idea what was unfolding, watched their home turn into a crime scene. Authorities stated they had located items of evidentiary interest. They didn't say what. They didn't confirm whether it was Morgan, but Sherry understood what that language often means. When law enforcement speaks carefully, it's usually because the truth is heavy. The search expanded. More digging, more processing, more quiet conversations behind the yellow tape. And then the case crossed the point every missing person family both fears and expects. Morgan's disappearance became a murder investigation. Human remains were found on the property, bones, fragments, evidence that confirmed the nightmare Sherry had tried not to name for 7 years. She had always said she wasn't ready to say goodbye until her daughter was found. Now found carried a meaning that could never be undone. Still, Sherry did what she had promised herself she would do. She prepared to bring Morgan home. Once the remains were located, arrests followed. The people who had been the last known companions in Morgan's timeline were now the center of the storm. Jonathan was found in Los Angeles. Caitlin was arrested out of state. They were held without bond. The case that had lived in limbo for 7 years suddenly accelerated, not because the system finally cared, but because the system finally had something that could not be ignored. Then the stories began to shift. Caitlin admitted she had been at the house, but claimed she walked into a bedroom and found Morgan already dead cold, not breathing. It was a story designed to create distance. "I didn't do it, I discovered it." But prosecutors didn't believe it. Investigators had spent years watching narratives bend around accountability, and this one felt familiar. Jonathan faced severe charges, including murder, evidence tampering, and concealment. As the investigation deepened, additional charges and details surfaced that were horrifying to read and even harder to say out loud. The court described conduct that went far beyond a simple homicide. Prosecutors indicated Morgan was killed. Her remains were handled in ways meant to destroy evidence and degrade her humanity. Some allegations surfaced in interviews that were not independently verified and were not necessarily part of the plea itself. That distinction matters. But even with careful language, the case was still one of the most disturbing outcomes possible for a young woman who had simply wanted to start over. A vigil was held at the park where Morgan's phone last pinged. People gathered with candles, holding light in their hands as if they could push it backward through time. Sherry spoke about loneliness, the kind of loneliness that comes from carrying a grief that no one else can fully understand. She thanked people for remembering her daughter, for refusing to let Morgan become just a name in a database. For 7 years, Sherry had lived inside a silence that most people can't imagine. And now, even with arrests, even with the case moving forward, the silence didn't disappear. It changed shape. It became the silence of a courtroom waiting for a verdict. The silence of details too violent to process. The silence of a reality that no sentence can reverse. Scene 6 eventually. Jonathan entered a plea to serious charges, and the court delivered a sentence that reflected the severity of the crime. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The language of the system tried to create closure, accountability, justice, resolution. But families know the truth. A conviction is not a happy ending. It's simply the moment when uncertainty finally stops being the loudest pain. Morgan's story remains brutal because it contains every ingredient of modern vulnerability. A young person moving across the country with minimal resources. Online arrangements that can collapse in a day. Employment that places someone in contact with strangers who may not be safe. A disappearance where the last known companions provide the timeline. And a system that struggles to move until technology, time, and pressure align. Even after sentencing, the case remained unfinished in another way. Caitlin's prosecution was still pending. The full truth of who did what, who planned what, who participated. Who knew those answers can take years, and sometimes they never become fully clear. And even if they do, Morgan is still gone. Her dreams are still frozen at 19. Her future never arrived. Her voice went silent in February 2016, and that silence lasted 7 years before anyone could definitively say what happened. Morgan's stepmother once said something that cuts through everything. Morgan had been missing longer than she had been physically alive in the lives of people who loved her. That means grief isn't just an aftermath. In cases like this, grief becomes a second life the family is forced to live. Scene 7. Morgan wanted a bigger life. She wanted a city. She wanted adventure. She wanted to spread her wings. There is nothing wrong with that. There is nothing shameful about a 19-year-old believing she can build something new. The tragedy isn't that Morgan took a risk. The tragedy is that someone saw her risk as an opportunity. And this is the part that sticks with people. Morgan's silence was the first sign of danger. When her phone stopped responding, when her social media froze, when her friends couldn't reach her, that wasn't a teenage mood swing. It was a red flag. For families watching this story, it becomes a lesson soaked in pain. If someone who is always reachable becomes unreachable, treat it as urgent. If a person's routine collapses overnight, listen to that. If your intuition screams, don't let anyone calm it down with convenient explanations. But the deeper lesson is even darker. Sometimes a missing person case stays missing not because the person vanished, but because the truth was hidden well enough to outlast attention. Morgan was not lost. She was concealed, buried under time, under distance, under narrative. And it took 7 years and one forgotten digital breadcrumb to crack the timeline wide open. Scene 8. At the end of all this, what remains isn't just the crime itself. It's the human cost. A mother living in motels, handing out flyers like a heartbeat. A family aging under uncertainty. Friends scrolling through old messages, stuck on delivered and seen, waiting for a reply that will never come. A young woman who wanted to be someone new, somewhere else, and never got the chance. At one vigil, Sherry spoke about candles, how the glow reflected the light Morgan brought into people's lives. She talked about laughter, about joy, about unconditional love. She asked people to remember Morgan not as a headline, not as a victim, not as a cautionary tale, but as a person who mattered. Because that is what true crime can forget if you don't hold it carefully. The victim is not the horror. The victim is the loss. Morgan's story is a warning. Yes, but not about ambition. It's a warning about how quickly dreams can be exploited, how silence can be weaponized, and how long it can take to force the truth to surface. 7 years. That's how long the silence lasted. And even now, even with a sentence, even with a case moving forward, there's a kind of silence that remains because no matter what the court says, Morgan will always be 19. And that is the part that never stops hurting.